introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you.
Okay, this is the third pat to speak tonight. The third pat on the board. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. He is a professor of English at UW-Fox Valley, a resident of Waupaca County. He and his lovely wife, Angela, who also teaches English at UW-Fox Valley, have 4 sons, and they reside right outside of Panama. Scott's educational background is quite impressive, and he is definitely a Midwestern guy in every respect. He was born in Minneapolis. He went to school at Minnesota State University in Moorhead for his bachelor's degree. He got an MA at the University of Iowa, a second MA and PhD at Purdue. So he really does stack up to be as Midwest gets. He has taught a variety of courses from the literature of sport to Shakespeare. And so without further ado, I give you Scott Hemingway.
Go get 'em. I'll put on the microphone.
Here, and we'll get that going. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here for the 600th presentation. That's amazing. I can't think of anything I've done 600 times in a row, so that's impressive. And I'm pleased to be here and excited to be here to talk about a subject that I enjoy and have been doing some research on for the last several years, and that is how American writers remember the First World War. First, just a little background about the First World War. It tends to be a rather understudied war. People are far more familiar with the Civil War and, of course, with the Second World War. So just a little bit of history. It, of course, starts in August of 1914. The United States, at first, is neutral, declares neutrality. Woodrow Wilson runs on a platform for his second term of keeping America out of the war. But German submarine warfare and skullduggery with Mexico and some other events caused the Americans to declare war 98 years ago today. So April 6, 1917, the United States enters the war. The United States had a very small standing army, so a number of soldiers had to be drafted and trained in a hurry, and it was a massive effort to prepare to go to war. Something like about 23 million soldiers were drafted and enlisted, 2 million of whom served in France. And the casualties that Americans incurred in a little over a year's worth of combat, it took a while to get combat troops to Europe, were over 300,000. So a significant investment by the United States. And naturally, American writers who experienced the war both as combatants and on the home front wrote about that war. This is a book that Steve Trout and I edited. It's an anthology of short stories about the war. And 2 things motivated Steve and me to want to do this book. First was just that the anniversary of the war was coming, the 100th anniversary of the beginning of the war in 1914 and coming up of America's involvement in 1917. And the second reason we wanted to do this book was to just represent the array of the kinds of stories that Americans were telling about the war. Because when I was in graduate school, I learned just one kind of narrative that writers wrote about, and I'll show you that. And I was surprised and interested in seeing how other writers responded to that war, other than what they teach you in college. I'd like to talk a little bit about, if I could, about the photograph, the painting that's the cover of our book, because it illustrates an idea that Steve and I had when we were putting together the collection. This is a painting from a stunning series of paintings by Claggett Wilson. He was an artist who served in the military, and then when he came back from serving in the First World War and was wounded, he created this series of paintings about his experiences over there. They are owned by the Smithsonian Museum, the American Art Museum of the Smithsonian, so you can go online and see some of these. And Claggett Wilson's great-nephew has a website. You just Google it and you'll see these paintings. Steve and I were really struck by this one, in parts because we thought the soldier was so striking, but also because of the story that Claggett Wilson told about the real event that he was trying to capture in this painting. This is a painting of a runner or a message carrier who was sent to the back lines through a woods that was under attack, that was being bombarded by the Germans. There were 3 runners sent back and only one made it. That was this one that Claggett Wilson painted. You can see he came out of the woods wounded and in shock, and Wilson writes that he had forgotten his message by the time he got through the barrage. So Steve and I thought this was a nice metaphorical representation of memory and war, and how often memory is fraught when it comes to war experience, and how it has to be reconstructed after the event. If you'll bear with me, I'd like to stay a little bit more with art that's not literary to illustrate the idea that Americans after the First World War had a number of different kinds of stories that they told about that war, and there wasn't a consistent overriding narrative. And I have this fella up here because you may have seen him. There's a statue of him in Appleton. So if you're in Appleton heading up Memorial Drive, you'll see this statue, so you may be familiar with him. It was called The Spirit of the American Doughboy, and by an artist named Vicani. And Vicani made this statue with the idea that it could be erected in lots of different towns. It was the kind of thing that he wanted people to put up lots of places. And there's, of course, a website you can go to that will show you where you can find this statue. There are several towns in Wisconsin besides Appleton where you can find it, and something like 35 other states you'll find a version of this statue. It's interesting, too, that there were also little lamp, like desk lamp versions you could buy, and it was this widely produced and purchased memorial of the war. But I'd like to take a little bit of a closer look at it to illustrate this idea that there were different kinds of stories that Americans were telling. And if you look at him first, you will see a great deal of realistic detail. From his helmet to his boots, this statue reproduces as a replica of the kind of equipment that a real doughboy, a real soldier, would have carried, right down to the rifle in his left hand, a 1903 model, Springfield model 1903 rifle. You can even see, perhaps at the bottom of his feet, even more realistic detail. Those are stumps at the bottom of his feet representing fence posts that would represent the no man's land through which the soldiers would attack. And if you've seen First World War photographs, you know what I'm talking about. The realistic detail was so acute in this statue that there was meant to be barbed wire stretched between those stumps to show the man, stepping over the barbed wire into no man's land. Now, a lot of town fathers wisely left the barbed wire off because you didn't want to have a statue at a public park where kids were climbing on barbed wire. But if you go online, you can see some statues in some of the places today in America where the barbed wire is there. So on the one hand, this is a very realistic portrayal of an American soldier. But there's also a great deal of what you might call romance and heroism to this, which is above and beyond a realistic portrayal. And that realism, or that lack of realism, starts with the posture of the soldier in the first place. This kind of charge would not be the way a soldier would charge a machine gun nest. I mean, this would have been suicide. So the upright posture is simply not accurate at all. Steve Trout does a brilliant analysis of this. And I don't know if you can notice, in his right hand, he's holding a hand grenade. And so the right hand raised often strikes me as kind of, swearing allegiance, a kind of patriotic gesture. But he has a hand grenade in his right hand. He's holding his rifle in his left. And Steve Trout wonders how could he have pulled the pin on that grenade that he's about to throw, unless he did the old Hollywood thing with the mouth, which is not how they did it. So that even the, it's not really a realistic portrayal of combat. It looks to me, more like a sort of throw over to first than it does, throwing a hand grenade. It's just not realistic at all. So I think you see these competing, almost mixed messages in this statue: the realism alongside the romanticized view of soldiers' real experiences. So let's talk then now about the writers and the stories they were telling. And we'll start with John Dos Passos. Because he's one of the first to write the kinds of stories, and this is when I was in graduate school, this was the kind of thing they told us everybody was writing. And that is of a combatant, somebody who saw combat and then came home and wrote about his experiences of having been disillusioned about the war and being embittered about the war. Dos Passos was not a soldier. He was a volunteer ambulance driver on the Western Front. And here we see him as a young man in his uniform. But when he came home from the First World War, he embarks on a career as a novelist. He's most well known for his 3 novels published in the 1930s that make up the USA trilogy, and you can see those on the right. But way before that, in 1922, he publishes a novel titled Three Soldiers. And it is about 3 American soldiers who go off to fight on the Western Front. And the 3 soldiers are disillusioned by their experience, and their lives go into a decline. It's less that the combat has disillusioned them, and more that the American Army, service in an American Army, which Dos Passos saw as making people less individual and infringing on their individual identity. That's really what causes the soldiers to be disillusioned in Three Soldiers. Three Soldiers is an okay book. The USA trilogy is brilliant, but it's very much a young man writing his way, into becoming a novelist. Still, when it came out in 1922, a lot of critics really admired this book and would say this is the war book. Dos Passos got it. He nailed what it would be like to have been a soldier on the Western Front. One such critic was H.L. Mencken, who wrote a very positive review of that book and said this is the quintessential American war novel. Another person who admired it would be certainly familiar to all of us, and that's this gentleman here, Ernest Hemingway. Ernest Hemingway knew Dos Passos, admired Three Soldiers. Ernest Hemingway was also a volunteer in an ambulance unit, only he served in Italy and not in France on the Western Front. He's wounded by mortar fire. He recuperates in Italy and then comes home to become Ernest Hemingway, the famous novelist, in part by writing novels that we still read today that are about First World War soldiers and their experiences after the war. Most notably, we have The Sun Also Rises in 1926, about a number of people who served in the war and are living in Spain and watching bullfighting and drinking way too much and cavorting way too much. The protagonist is Jake Barnes. If you remember, Jake Barnes is wounded in action and he's rendered impotent. He's in love with Lady Brett Ashley. Lady Brett Ashley is also a veteran of the war. She served as a volunteer nurse. And it just seems like everybody is suffering from that war and trying to speed up their lives too much in consequence. A Farewell to Arms is also a familiar novel to us today. This is about somebody serving in Italy who deserts from the army and falls in love with a nurse, and bad things happen. But before those 2 novels, Hemingway wrote a brilliant collection of short stories, In Our Time, which also is in many ways about the First World War and people and their experiences in it. One of the stories in Our Time that I absolutely love and I recommend is called The Soldier's Home, A Soldier's Home. And it's about a soldier who comes back from, you read the story and you realize he has fought in every major battle that Americans were in. And he comes back to his small Oklahoma town. And he doesn't want to do anything but sit on the front porch. And particularly his mother is baffled by this and annoyed by this and wonders why he doesn't just take the family car and go date the nice girls in the neighborhood and just get back into civilian life. Well, today we might see that character Krebs as being suffering from PTSD, but no one really understands him and no one really understands what he's been through, and he can't reintegrate into his small town life. So again, there's this narrative of a soldier who's damaged by war and comes home to a public that doesn't really understand what he's been through. Here's a lesser-known writer I can highly recommend, William Edward March Campbell. He was a Marine officer. He was wounded in action. He was highly decorated. You can see here he is in his uniform. You can see his decorations right there on his chest. And William Edward March Campbell, when he returns from war, writing under the name William March, produces a novel that people compare favorably to All Quiet on the Western Front. A number of critics see this as the best American novel about combat set in the First World War. It's a really great book, and it's an interesting one because it doesn't have a single character who is followed all the way through. There's no Jake Barnes, there's no single character you follow. It's really a series of vignettes. Many of the stories were published originally as separate short stories. And each story or each chapter is about a different soldier in Company K and what happens to that soldier. And often it is not positive kinds of things that happen to these soldiers. Again, you've got a writer who wants to represent what he sees as the realism of the war for a public that, even in 1933, may not be receptive to them. Here's another writer who's familiar. Here's F. Scott Fitzgerald. What may not be less known is that Fitzgerald was also part of the war effort. He enlists in the Army. He drops out of prison, but the rumor was he was going to be kicked out anyway because his grades were bad. So he goes into the Army. He becomes a lieutenant. He wasn't the greatest officer, but you see him here in his uniform. And Fitzgerald never made it overseas. His unit is ready to ship out, and then the war ends. And for the rest of his life, he regrets that. He feels like he missed out on something that, of course, his friend Ernest Hemingway was part of at Dos Passos, that he didn't quite get there when other men of his age did. What you may also not remember is that he writes about First World War veterans in a lot of his work. We all know The Great Gatsby. We know that novel. Nick, the narrator, is a First World War veteran. Gatsby is a First World War veteran. And the two men meet, and their first moment of meeting, they talk about service in the Army and in the war. And that's one of the reasons that they bond. It's one of the reasons that Nick winds up admiring Gatsby so much. In a later novel, in 1934, Dick Diver is the protagonist, the main character, and he regrets that he didn't serve in the First World War, very much like Fitzgerald. Didn't get there, wasn't part of that. But this is a theme that writing about First World War veterans is a theme you see even earlier in Fitzgerald's career. In 1922, he publishes Mayday in a collection. It originally came out in 1920, and it's a really interesting story. It's one that Steve and I included in the anthology. It's a sprawling tale, kind of a madcap tale set in New York City, and it follows a couple of different, 3 or 4 different, some of the characters are veterans of the First World War. One is an upper-class young man who went to an Ivy League school and then went off to war, very much like Fitzgerald imagined himself, and came home and just can't get his life together. He's trying to borrow money from his old college friends, and they're putting him off. And so Fitzgerald, even as early as 1920, is asking, well, what's going to happen to these veterans when they come home and they have to reintegrate into civilian life, and they just can't quite manage that. So again, you see in Fitzgerald that story that they told me in grad school was what the story everybody told, was the disillusioned soldier, the soldier who had a hard time coming home. So let's talk about a different kind of story that was told about First World War veterans, and this may surprise you. Here's Willa Cather. We love Willa Cather. I love Willa Cather. Readers love Willa Cather. We know Willa Cather, though, maybe best from her Nebraska novels. Hardy Pioneers, right? And Oh Pioneers, and My Antonia, right? Those are beautiful books. What you may not know is that Willa Cather wrote a novel about a character who served in the First World War, and it's this one of ours, which was published in 1922. The main character, Claude Wheeler, is based on her cousin, Willa Cather's cousin, so it has a real basis. Now, about the first 2/3 of this novel has nothing really to do with World War I. It's set in Nebraska, and we follow Claude's life. And Claude is unhappy in Nebraska. He doesn't fit in. He makes a horrible marriage. He tries college. Nebraska is just not where he wants to be. So when the First World War begins, he sees it as an opportunity to get out of Nebraska. And he enlists. And he just takes to it. He even likes training camp. He's on the ship going over to France, and that's an adventure for him. He finally gets to Europe. He finally gets to France. He sees combat. So only the last third of the novel is he actually in the Army, but it is an adventure for him. And again, this is based on letters and speaking to her and knowing her cousin, her cousin. Now, she tells this story, and critics dislike it. H.L. Mencken, who loved Three Soldiers, hated one of ours. He writes a scathing review, and he says, the poor woman, she got her war stuff from Hollywood. She didn't know what she was writing about. She was never over there. She's just a woman. This is not the kind of story that really happened. Ernest Hemingway writes a letter to somebody and says pretty much the same thing. Poor Willa Cather. She doesn't know what she's writing about. She has no idea. She touched a nerve. Now, it's a very popular book. It's a bestseller. It wins the Pulitzer Prize. And it's a good book. Maybe her bestseller to that date, up to that date. I think this is just my theory. Why did the critics react so harshly against that? Why did Ernest Hemingway look at Claude Weather and say, this guy, he's not the real soldier? My theory is because Claude Weather is uncomfortably close to Ernest Hemingway's real experience. Ernest Hemingway wanted to have an adventure. He wanted to go to war and have an adventure. That was something a lot of young men in America, this was a way to go have a wider experience, was to go off to war. And they went off to war with that kind of enthusiasm. Unfortunately, Claude Weather is killed before he can come home and be disillusioned. And that's, I think, kind of what bothered Ernest Hemingway, right? We don't get the whole story. And I don't think Hemingway really wanted to acknowledge himself how young and naive he was before he went to war. He wanted not to tell that kind of story. And this is just a theory. I have no proof of this. I think psychologically this story bugged him, this novel. But you get a much different kind of story. It is not the disillusioned soldier. It is not that kind of story at all. And interestingly enough, when I was in graduate school, we read O Pioneers, and but nobody gave me this one, okay? And I wish they had. So in that vein of telling different kinds of stories about soldiers, I'd like to give you some writers you may never have heard of, so you can go take a look at them. And one such fellow is this, Leonard H. Newman, who has an interesting life story himself. Leonard Newman served in the Army during the First World War and again during the Second World War. And he's buried at Arlington National Cemetery, so he had a distinguished war career, or time in the Army. Between the two wars, in the 1920s and 1930s, he writes a series of popular fictions about American soldiers. Here are 3 of his novels from that time. He writes a host of short stories, lots of them. They're published in places like the Saturday Evening Post, a very popular magazine for the time. They're also, interestingly enough, published in magazines that are put out by the American Legion. So the American Legionnaires are reading Leonard H. Newman's stories about being at war and being in combat in the magazine of their organization. And Leonard H. Newman's stories tend to be about comrades in arms, about men who come home from the war and can talk about it, and it has been a positive experience for them. When he writes about, one of the stories we have in the book is from him, when he writes about soldiers in combat, they're competent. They get the job done. Maybe in spite of their officers sometimes, but the common American soldier gets the job done. It's very much a positive portrayal of the American soldier. And as I said, these are very popular stories. They're everywhere, okay, in the time. And not the disillusioned soldier, not at all. Here's another writer that you may be familiar with and you may have seen before, but you may be surprised that she wrote anything at all about the First World War. This is Edna Ferber. And I put these pictures on here on purpose because there's kind of a before and after. You see Edna Ferber, she lived in Appleton for a while. Her formative years were in Appleton. She worked for the Appleton newspaper. That was her first professional writing job. I like the one on the left because there's Edna Ferber, the young woman. And then on the right, you see her all Hollywood glam because she becomes, she goes from being Edna Ferber, the bright young woman from Appleton to the best-selling writer of books like Showboat, which becomes a Broadway play and a film, and Giant, which becomes a blockbuster movie, still a great movie. So she becomes this superstar writer. But you might be surprised about how she got her beginning, what she wrote at the beginning of her career. And her first success was creating this character, Emma McChesney. And Emma McChesney was a traveling salesman. She used that word to describe herself, salesman, in the early 20th century. Not a time when a lot of women worked outside of the home, and certainly not as traveling salesmen who took their samples on the train and went to towns alone by themselves and stayed in strange hotels and that kind of thing. These stories were very popular. They were in popular magazines. They're collected in 3 different volumes that sell very well. And they're selling so well that she's offered a lot of money to continue writing these. They offer $1,000 a story. $1,000 a story. $1,000. You give me $1,000 now, I'll write you anything you want. Okay, $1,000 a story in 1917, right? That's pretty good money. But she thought, well, if I keep writing these Emma McChesney stories, I'm not going to go on and write anything else, right? I'm not going to write Showboat or whatever. I'm just not going to do that. But she brought back Emma McChesney for a late story that Steve and I found and put in the anthology. It's published in 1918. And it's a very patriotic story. It's published in 1918 when the American soldiers are fighting in the Meuse-Argonne, and it's a kind of bloody battle. And it's really designed as kind of a propaganda piece to keep America's morale up. So it has that kind of function to it. But there's more to that story than just that. Because essentially the story is Emma McChesney is volunteering, and she gets to wear a uniform, and she's working for some social service organization, something like the Red Cross. And she's married to the man who owns the company that she works for, and he doesn't get to go to war. He has to be a businessman. So Emma McChesney figures out a way where her husband and other men in her life can go to war, and the business can still run. And that way is the men will go to war, and the women stay home and run the business. So you see patriotic men doing their duty. They go to war. They put on the uniform as men are supposed to. But you see a very sly feminist message as well, and that is the war effort would not have been possible unless the women stayed home and took care of the home front, such as running the businesses, capably and successfully. So she gets both messages in there, and still, but again, it's a very positive portrayal of America's involvement in the First World War. So as you can tell by now, Steve and I are digging pretty deep. You know, we're looking for some stuff. You know, it's not Hemingway. It's not just, you know, we're looking at some writers that people have forgotten. And here's one. It's interesting what he writes, and he has a very interesting story that we stumbled on that I find fascinating. This is George L. Stout. Now, that's not him. That's George Clooney. But George L. Stout is the writer. George L. Stout wrote a great story that we published in the anthology called Dust. And I liked it a lot because it was about the home front. The story is about an older father, his second marriage, he has a son, and the son just leaves the farm and joins the Army and writes him a letter from training camp that says, "Dear Dad, you know, I'm in the Army, sorry, you know, I'm not coming home, okay?" And the father decides to go find him. We go to the training camp. He goes to Fort Dodge, Iowa, a real training camp, huge place, to look for his son. He doesn't find him. They don't get to say goodbye. So it's a very moving story about what happens to families and how war separates families. It's a home front story. So we loved it, and we put it in the anthology. But of course, you got to write something about the writer. Who's this George L. Stout when he's home? I never heard of him. Who is he? And I started digging into who he was, and I found out that George L. Stout was a monuments man. So he served in the First World War, and then during the Second World War, if you've seen the movie, and it's based on a book, you see it in the upper left-hand corner there, these were men who knew something about art, and they went in uniform off to war, so to speak, but they went off to protect the art, to try to protect the art from the bombs falling, to try to talk generals into not blowing things up because it might have a painting in it. Well, good luck with that. And try to save the art from the Nazis. The Nazis were stealing art all over the place. So in the film, they changed his name. It's George Clooney who plays George L. Stout. That character plays that man because I found that fascinating, that he had this whole other career. He was most known as an art historian, or an art restorer and a museum curator than he was as a writer. But early on, as a young man, he wrote this great story called Dust. He published it in an interesting magazine, just so I want to spend a minute talking about that, called The Midland. The Midland was originally begun in Iowa City, Iowa, and was published there for a number of years. The man who ran it took it to other cities eventually. And it's a real treasure trove of great fiction. There were a number of famous writers who published in it, and a number of writers who were just good that no one today even knows, such as George L. Stout and Emma S. Hunting, who is perhaps more known for having a famous or somewhat famous sister. Emma S. Hunting is the older sister of Ruth Sukow, who's an Iowa regionalist writer, and there's a Ruth Sukow Society in Iowa. People still read her books. They love her stuff. She writes about rural Iowa experience in the early 20th century. Emma was her older sister and a talented woman in her own right, and published some stories in the Midland, including one that I just thought was excellent, and I wanted to put it in the collection, and that's The Soul That Sinneth. And The Soul That Sinneth is, again, a home front story. What happens at home when soldiers go off to war? And the story follows, it has a number of different perspectives or points of view. One of the points of view is the farmer, an Iowa farmer, whose only son enlists in the Army, and his father is angry. Why did he do that? Why did he not stay home and help me farm? You know, it's that kind of anger. He left me, he abandoned me, that kind of thing. The story gets complicated when the telegram comes and the son has died of pneumonia in training camp. And so it's really a portrayal of family grief, this story. So when the son's coffin comes home with the flag on it, the father, in his rage, rushes out from where he's been hiding and tears the flag off the coffin and stomps it in the dirt, because that's what he thinks of his son having been in the Army. I think a more sympathetic portrayal of grief is the mother's grief in this story, which is a lot quieter and a lot more pained. So you get both parents and how they feel when their only son is killed because he's become a soldier, or dies because he's become a soldier. And that plot line of soldiers dying of disease, of course, is based on real life events. You know about the flu epidemic, the pandemic that hit at this time. And this is a picture I found online at Fort Riley, Kansas. These are all men who are suffering from that flu. A lot of soldiers did die before they saw combat. They died of disease. It's interesting to me, though, that it tends to be the female writers, the women writers, who write about that kind of story. So we see M.S. Hunting writing about it. Willa Cather has some of this in one of ours, because there's the flu on the troop ship that Claude is on when they go to France. And another beautiful portrayal of this is in a novella that we republished in the anthology by Catherine Ann Porter with the title Pale Horse, Pale Rider. It's just a beautiful love story. And I'm giving it away, but it has a flu death in it. It tends to be the women writers, just in my experience, who write about, you know, the men are writing about, as Hemingway said, being blown up, right? That's what he wrote about, okay? And the women write about, often, about disease. And I suppose that's largely because women in their home front role and in one of the main roles they took in the war were caretakers for soldiers who were dying. And here's a writer who was also a nurse, Mary Borden. And I like people to know about her because she wrote a terrific book called The Forbidden Zone. Mary Borden was from Chicago. She was wealthy. Her family had significant money. And using her own money, she established what today we would call probably a mobile Army surgical hospital, a hospital that moved around behind the lines on the Western Front. You see her there. You can see Mary right there in her white nurses. I don't know how she wore those high heels and walked around, but you know, there she is in her white 1918 nurse's outfit, and you see the men working with her unloading the ambulance. Okay, so she was right there, not at the front lines, but pretty close behind them when the men were coming in, and she saw it all. She writes this book, The Forbidden Zone. It's an interesting collection because it's poetry and vignettes and some short stories, and they're beautiful. Steve and I wanted to have one of her stories in the book. The one we chose is called Rosa, and it's a hard story to explain because the soldier dies and no one really knows who Rosa is. He's talking about Rosa, and they don't know who Rosa is. And I think it kind of expresses Borden's idea that, you know, I took care of these men, but who were they? You know, what were they like inside? Okay, I took care of their bodies, and that's all. Okay. The last fiction writer I'd like to talk about is this fellow right here, Claude McKay. And Claude McKay is best known as a poet. He's a poet in the Harlem Renaissance, during the Harlem Renaissance in New York City. He was from Jamaica. He immigrates to the United States. But he's also known as a fiction writer. And he wrote this novel, Home from Harlem, published in 1928, which has an African-American soldier in it as a character who deserts from the Army. And the novel exposes the treatment that African-American soldiers received when they went into service during the First World War. A number of African-Americans believed that, well, if we served in the war and we did so honorably, we could come home and they would accept us. They would have to give us our civil rights. White America would have to recognize our sacrifice. But it didn't work out quite that way. Very few African-American units saw combat. I even read recently that African-American units in training camp sometimes weren't even given real weapons to train with. You know, they just would give them wooden guns or whatever. Because when they got to France, a lot of what they did was labor. They unloaded the ships. One of the duties they had, very unpleasant, was reburying the dead bodies. This is what African American soldiers did. And the protagonist, Jake Brown, in this novel walks away from that. He says, I'm not going to do that, and he leaves it. And bravely, I think, Claude McKay is exposing this for American readers. You know, African Americans went over to war, and this is how you treated them. But that's a novel, and Steve and I were doing short stories, so we wanted to put a short story by Claude McKay in there. And this is a story that the history of the story itself may be more interesting than the story, but you can decide, you can read it. But it also illustrates why I just love this research, because it took me in directions I didn't know I was going to go in. Claude McKay wrote a short story called The Soldier's Return, and it is about white racism directed against African-American soldiers. The soldier in the story comes home to a small town, and he gets into serious trouble because he's still wearing that Army uniform. In fact, the sheriff says, take that uniform off, don't wear that. And you can read the story. The history of the story may be even more interesting. Claude McKay wrote it while he was living in the Soviet Union. And it's published, it's translated first into Russian, and then published in Russian in the Soviet Union. And then for about 50 years, disappears. Then in the mid-1970s, it's rediscovered and translated from the Russian back into English. In the original English version, we don't have that. We only have the Russian now back into English. So it's not, I'm sure it's not what Claude McKay wanted us to see, because you've got that kind of, you know, multiple translation. It's published in 1977 in a book that was put out by an Indian press associated with an Indian university. And scholars knew about this and were writing about it. But the general public, people didn't know about this story. It just wasn't available. It was in this obscure book by this obscure publisher. Steve and I wanted to include it, so then we went on the adventure of trying to find who held copyright for this story. So I did the lazy thing. I looked on the Google and I tried to find this publisher, and was there anything about them, and were they still in business, and the university had even changed its name, and the publisher was no longer in existence. The editors of the collection, though, were American scholars. So I tracked down the editor, had been a professor at a university, was retired. I called his university. The secretary there did a no-no, and she told me his home address. Thank you for doing that. I'm supposed to do that. So I wrote the man a letter, and I said, could you please tell me, you know, who has copyright for this story? He handwrites me a beautiful letter in return, beautiful penmanship, and tells me interesting things about this publication of this story. He tells me, for example, that the man who was the editor of the press, the Indian scholar, has passed away. His wife went off to an ashram and disappeared into her spiritual quest, and nobody knew where she was. So as far as he knew, I wasn't going to get anywhere trying to find anybody in India who could help me. So he thought, as far as he knew, that he had the copyright. He held the copyright for this. And in this handwritten letter, he said, yes, you can have this. I haven't even asked him really yet. He said, yes, you can have this story. You can republish this story. I contacted him, and I contacted the translator, who was a colleague of him at the same university and was also retired, but I was happy that he was still answering his email from the campus email system. So I got a hold of him a lot easier. And both of the men could not have been nicer. They said, sure. You know, we did this in 1977, and how many years ago was that? You can go ahead and have the story and republish it. So now it's in our collection. And that's the last fiction writer I want to talk about. I'd just like to end by talking about one nonfiction book. Over here on the table, I have a collection of books, just idiosyncratic stuff that I've collected over the years you want to take a look at. I have a journal article in this Midwestern Miscellany about that Edna Ferber story, about the Emma McChesney story. For some reason, they sent me an absurd number of free copies. I don't know why. So if you're really interested, you could take one of these for nothing and go home. It's a journal. It's an article, a collection of articles about fashion in American Midwestern fiction, and I contributed to that. But one of the books I don't have is this one, because I owned it to my brother and he didn't give it back to me. And it's a fascinating book. So if you're kind of a nonfiction person, I often get that. People say, well, you know, what do you teach? And I teach fiction. Well, I really like nonfiction. So if you like nonfiction, this is a great book, and I can highly recommend it. Richard Rubin began this book at a time when a lot of people were writing about the Second World War generation, the Second World War veteran. And he realized, you know, hey, there are still some American First World War veterans around, but these people were over 100 years old. So I had better talk to them before it's too late. So he tracked down a number of them and got their stories, and they're fascinating. The way he lays out their stories. It's just a great book. And I wanted to end with this also, not just because, you know, my brother copped the book and would give it back to me, but I wanted to end with this also because I began with the idea that memory is fraught. You know, that memory is a fragile thing, and sometimes you don't always remember it accurately. But these men and some women that he interviews, their memories are incredible. They're 105, 106. They went to a war when they were 19, 18, 20. And what they remember about that war in the detail that they can remember it in is astounding. So maybe memory isn't always fraud. Maybe we do remember accurately something like that. But please check out Ruben's book. Well, that's all I have. So thank you very much for listening. I'm really happy to talk about it. Go ahead. Yeah. Sure, yeah. What did I have for dinner yesterday? I don't remember. But, you know, when I was at Antietam, that I remember, right? Or when I was, you know, was on the line, they remember that kind of thing. Yeah, one of the men he interviews was an African American, and he confirms everything that McKay said. This is what they did. You know, this is kind of what they did for me. Okay, what they did to me. So it's great history, and vivid. You bet. Yes, please. Yeah. Well, it's interesting. The British authors, remember, tend to be the poets. You know, Rupert Brooke, okay? You know, Siegfried Sassoon, great poets. I mean, these were officers, right? And they're in the trenches literally writing sonnets. It just blows my mind, okay? So, yeah, there are some great British fiction writers, but we tend to think, well, British, World War, it's these poets, okay? It's these great poets. It's interesting what happens with American poetry. Over here I have a collection by a guy named Van Wienen, who put out the poetry that Americans were writing about the war. And it tends to stop at 1919. They don't really write a lot of poetry after 1919. And he collects a lot of poetry that Americans wrote. Some of it was published in newspapers. This is amazing to me, that you'd pick up the New York Times, and there would be this poem about the war. And what he traces is the interesting shift between early on, when America was neutral, a lot of anti-war poetry, keep us out of that war. And then the war is declared, and no, we can't write that anymore. Then it's pro-war poetry, and it stops about 1919. So yeah, I like the British writers. I recently read a memoir by a Frenchman who served in the French army through all 4 years. He made it all the way through. And it's an interesting book because it was not published until the 1970s. It was this memoir that he'd written, and his family had it, and then it was taught by a local high school teacher who had parts of it. And so we're still getting, just as, I don't want to use this metaphor, just as they're still turning up debris on the battlefields, right? We're still getting these stories that are coming out that have, you know, been in people's attics and that kind of thing. So yeah, have you read? Who's your favorite British author of the First World War?
I just know, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, speaking of that, Wilfred Owen, of course, is one of the great writers, poets of the war era, and English, British. And most of his things were written as letters home he put in. But the interesting thing about his life, he was a lieutenant, I think it was, and he died 2 days before the armistice. So he never was able to basically cash in, if you will, on his writing.
No.
It was all kind of post-mortem as far as his, you know, his fame, if you will.
Yeah.
But he also was able to pretty much capture, I think, the spirit of the servicemen in the actual trenches.
Yeah. With all saints and core mass, right? You know that poem, right? Okay, that's the one that we teach in the schools today.
Well, and I think we forget in America that our involvement really was quite short in terms of